All right, I'm ready when you are.
Good.
I'm rolling here. Okay. I'm Bob Crawford,
I'm Ben Sawyer.
and this is The Road to Now. Ben, every Christmas Eve, when I am snuggled up with a glass of wine watching It's a Wonderful Life on television, I say to myself, man, we need to do an It's a Wonderful Life episode. But I remember this on Christmas Eve. This year, I remembered before Christmas Eve. And so here we are. We're going to talk about It's a Wonderful Life. Can I just give you some background to the film? So, in case someone out there listening hasn't seen the movie, we can all be up to speed together.
Yes, go for it.
It's a 1946 Frank Capra film. Frank Capra, one of the most incredible American directors of the 20th century. The film has made a lasting impression around the world. It's over 70 years old, and it's a Christmas classic that is transcendent, and it's inspired multiple generations with its message of forgiveness, self-denial, and the importance of serving others. It's a Wonderful Life, Ben. It's a secular film, but it seems to be deeply rooted in a Christian worldview that plays on biblical thematic material. The film evokes religious, political, and social themes. It's set in the small town of Bedford Falls in upstate New York at the end of World War II. It tells the story of George Bailey, a man who has spent his life forgoing his own aspirations out of a sense of duty, loyalty, and love for those in his family who run the local community building. Sorry, Ben, who run the local savings and loan. After his absent-minded professor, Uncle Billy, misplaces a large deposit, the savings and loan is put in jeopardy. When the wealthiest, greediest man in town, Mr. Potter, accuses George of stealing the missing funds, George becomes so despondent that he considers jumping off a bridge on Christmas Eve. George jumps off the bridge, but he's saved by his guardian angel in training, Clarence, who has been sent from heaven to show George the way his life has impacted the lives of his family members and members of his community. Now, Ben, if it sounds like I'm reading this, I am, because it's from a paper I wrote in 2017 for Cutter Calloway's Theology in the Arts class at Fuller Theological Seminary. Now, if you went to the Avett at the Beach Festival in 2017 and you were out on the beach having a great time, having a few drinks with your community, with the people that you love, with the people whose lives you've impacted, and you wondered, what are Bob, Scott, Seth, Joe, what are they doing right now? Well, Bob was in his hotel room writing this paper. Why did I write this paper? Because this is my favorite movie. And so it's really exciting for me today to welcome our guest, Dr. Eric Smoodin, who is a professor in the programs of American Studies and Film Studies at UC Davis. And he's written a book about the director of It's a Wonderful Life, Frank Capra, called Frank Capra, Audience, Celebrity, and American Film Studies, 1930 to 1960. Dr. Smoodin, Eric, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're thrilled to have you here. So, Dr. Smoodin, you have written several books about film. And why Frank Capra? What attracted you to this American director?
Well, a lot of it is really just personal taste. One of the first films I really watched carefully and a lot when I was just a kid, when I was about 15 or so, was a film called It Happened One Night, which is a Frank Capra film from 1934. And I was just knocked out by it. I think I watched it growing up in LA 3 times the same weekend. And I was just really knocked out. Right after that, this was around 1970 or so, Capra had started a kind of rehabilitative tour in terms of his reputation. He wrote an autobiography and was doing the college tour, that kind of thing. And so I read the autobiography that he wrote. I love that, even though now we know it's mostly fictional. And so I just became a big fan. And it was that film and reading that book that got me into thinking about, wow, could I make a career out of studying film? And so Capra was really foundational to my being, a film historian. And I think when I first saw It's a Wonderful Life, which was probably a couple of years after that, when I was 17 or 18, I liked it, but it didn't resonate much. And now, 50 years later, I see it, and it just seems really deep and really nuanced and really just an amazing, dense, rich film that I keep coming back to, and that I'm happy to say my students really respond to as well. So, I began 50 years ago or so by falling in love with another Capra film. And then over time, this film has really seemed to me to be a significant major film. And also, it's such an important film in Capra's career. And it's kind of his last great film after, which then led to a kind of astonishingly precipitous decline. So it seems to be a pivotal film in a lot of ways.
One of the things there's a couple of things that struck me about this film. And first thing I want to admit is that when I was prepping for this, I was like, okay, I need to go back and watch the film. I was like, I've seen it 100 times, right? I need to go back and watch it. You know what? It turns out I haven't seen that film 100 times. I've seen the last 30 minutes of that film 100 times.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I was watching it, I was like 2 hours and like, what was it, like 2 hours and 18 minutes of runtime or something like this. And I was watching it and I was like so into it. I was like, this film is fantastic. And the first thing that struck me is the moments that everybody knows are like the last 30 minutes of that film. The beginning part of that film is so well built up, and my God, the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's so good, and it's so choppy. Like, I mean, not so choppy, but like it's so like on point, and it's funny, and it's so well written, and it stands out from most films of that time. Where do you attribute that? Is that in the screenwriter? Is that in the way it's shot? What do you think really brings forth that dialogue?
I think it's a bunch of things. Capra had a long history of working with fantastic writers. He worked with Robert Riskin for a long time on a bunch of the films we really think of now. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, You Can't Take It With You. He worked with Sidney Buckman, who was a great writer on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So Capra, who always wanted to be a writer himself, really understood the value of writing. And so he made sure he worked with the very best people imaginable. And what we also tend to forget about him, and I think you mentioned it in the intro, in 1946, he's one of the most well-respected filmmakers in the world. So people want to work with him as well. So a Capra film, we think of him as a director, but a Capra film also means all the best people working with him. And he had incredible writers at various stages of this film. It goes through a whole bunch of rewrites. So that, I think you're right. People who haven't seen the film or have only seen parts of the film kind of think of it as sort of a Hallmark card. But then you see the film and you go, wow, this is incredible. The writing is amazing and the characterizations are fantastic and rich and dense. And I think, those were the trademarks of a Capra film at that time that we tend to forget, that his name was shorthand for the guy who was at the camera, the people who were editing this, the people who wrote this. It was quality from the top down. And the very best people in Hollywood worked for him.
And one of those very best people was Jimmy Stewart, the lead actor, George Bailey. And this was Stewart's first film after he served in World War II. He was an Air Force pilot, I believe. He was in the reserve. He rose to the rank of Brigadier General, which I didn't know till last night watching Jimmy Stewart Tonight Show interviews. Mm-hmm. But there's a darkness in this movie, right? Yeah. Eric, would you say there's a noir? Is this can we consider some of this noir? And what did Stewart's experience in World War II maybe bring to the film? Did he help bring that darkness?
Well, we should say that this is both Stewart's first film and Capra's first film. Capra had been away at war for 4 years as well. He was the head of the Signal Corps film division that was making the Why We Fight films and other documentaries that that enlisted guys saw. So for both of them, it's the first film back. And both of them, and Stewart especially, had had experiences that, you know, we can only imagine. And I think that Stewart himself, we later found out, was suffering from a great deal of PTSD the rest of his life because he had been in combat. So this is a serious film for both of them. Neither one of them is that sure of where his career is in 1946, because while Capra is still an incredibly respected director, he hadn't made a film in a long time. Stewart hadn't made a film in a long time after having become a huge star with films like You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the Capra films, films like Philadelphia Story. So neither man was fully sure of his position in Hollywood at the time, even though, of course, they were still stars. So I think they both bring this sense of this film is a real test, and we have to make sure it's as great as it can possibly be. At the same time, films had changed a little bit. You mentioned the film noir. We think of the dark detective urban films, which is the last thing you associate with a Capra film at this time, and even with a Stewart film. But in fact, people like Capra and the writers he's working with are very well aware of what's going on in Hollywood. And in fact, when I show this film to my students, one of the films we counterpose this to is Citizen Kane, the great Orson Welles film of 1941, which is also one of the very first noir films, the story of a man's life where the man is, we're not quite sure how we're supposed to think about him. And in some ways, It's a Wonderful Life is Capra's Citizen Kane, where it takes us back to view the life of a man, how he got to where he is. And so in that way, it does invoke the dark film noir-y aspects of so much of American film in the 1940s. So it is both a Capra film in a whole bunch of senses of the world, and also a departure. And also the same is true for Jimmy Stewart, who, you know, wins his Academy Award for the Philadelphia Story, which is a fantastic, sophisticated comedy, but not a film like this. And of course, this becomes a springboard for Stewart's career to make some very dark Westerns in the 50s that are incredible, but very much going against type in terms of the character he had established before the war. So in some ways, It's a Wonderful Life launches a different kind of Jimmy Stewart and sort of ends Capra's career. So it's very different for both men, even though it's kind of a major coming back film, and a film that invokes all the stuff that's been going on in American film for 5 years or so.
So you say this is this test after you know this break of World War II. Both these men come back in, and you know the cast is remarkable. I actually nerded out and read some like reviews of the film from when it came out in old newspapers. And you know, red lines. I started out reading the local ones, like from the Tennessean right here in Nashville. You know, and they pick up some national stuff, but it's just like Capra won't rest till he has the greatest talent in Hollywood. You know, he's like they recently signed in like Lionel Barrymore to play the bank, and you're just like, they're talking about this. It's hyped up, but while they're casting it, like even in the local newspaper.
Yeah.
But that test, surprising, I think to most people right now, they probably failed that test because the film did not do well in the box office, correct?
You know, this has been a point of contention. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but this has been a point of contention for a long time. One of the other things that this marks for Capra is a different kind of production. Capra at this time has become an independent producer, one of the first to be that in Hollywood. This will kind of set the tone for what happens in the 50s. He forms a company with two of the most important directors at the time, George Stevens and William Wyler. Wyler is roughly Capra's contemporary, has been making films for a long time. Stevens is a younger man who is considered as a Capra 2.0. His films are Capra films, but sexier and more cosmopolitan, that kind of thing. And so this becomes a test of a new kind of Hollywood production where outside of the studios, three men form their own company. And of course, this comes with a whole lot of risks and financial difficulties. Capra is the only one of the three men who's able to make a film. The other two are contractually bound to other studios. So there's a lot riding on It's a Wonderful Life, which is the first film made by Liberty Films, the name of their film production company. And so they lavish a lot of money on this film. When it opens in 1946, it does well. It's not a blockbuster by any means, but it does okay. But it can't make back the costs.
So Eric, just for context, I have this in front of me. It cost $3,180,000 to make as of December 3rd. It premieres on January 7th, 1947. As of December 31st of that year, it had grossed $7,027,000.
So it makes way more than it costs. But in the Hollywood economy, you've got to do much more than that to make money. So the problem was it wasn't the kind of blockbuster that it could have been. And it, of course, opens, I think the same week, perhaps the same day, or around the same time as the great, great, great World War II film of 1946, The Best Years of Our Lives, which is an astonishing film still today and is the big film of that moment. And so it kind of dwarfs It's a Wonderful Life.
So that's William Wyler.
Yeah, that's William Wyler, who was Capra's partner, but Wyler is contractually bound to another studio to make that film. So it's not a film made under their own production company. Wyler makes that film for Samuel Goldwyn and still has a few more years worth of films for other studios to work out before he can even begin to make a film for his own company, which was one of the great ironies of that period. So he's competing with himself in some ways, Wyler is, and sort of blows the Capra film out of the water, because that's the film that we think of now, and it is a great, great film.
They are both incredible films, and I just came to The Best Years of Our Lives within the past few years, and I had read about it in history books, people referring to it, but I'd never seen it. I saw it and it blew me away. And Ben, this is something I've wanted to bring up with you from time to time. And I just purchased a book about that someone wrote in the past 2 years about this film. But Ben, this is a movie that, like, we don't know what it was like to live in the days of World War II in America. We just know what we read about it, or what did Americans think of the war? What did they really think of the war? And The Best Years of Our Lives, which chronicles the story of three veterans coming home from World War II, each having a different experience, but each experiencing hardship, coming back to the post-war United States. And everybody didn't support the war. Everybody didn't support the veterans. There were some who thought we fought on the wrong side. And we never tell that story. You would never tell that story or say that now you would probably, but before 2016, you would never say that. But they were saying that in 1946, 47. That was being said.
Yeah, it's an incredible film and it should be seen. It's an amazing film. And I think, it's very hard to talk about what film captures a zeitgeist, but that film seems to, in a way that It's a Wonderful Life possibly did not. And so The Best Years of Our Lives deservedly wins all the Academy Awards, gets all the praise. And that film too has aged incredibly well. And when we see it now, it still is a resonant, deep film with guys who suffer from PTSD, they drink way too much, their lives are ruined. That too is a rich, dense, deep film that has aged incredibly well. And that's the film that people think of. That's the film that people went to see. And that's the film that people think of now. So It's a Wonderful Life does fine, but it doesn't quite capture the same kind of, if zeitgeist the word, it doesn't quite capture that the way The Best Years of Our Lives does, and so was kind of forgotten fairly quickly.
So put them together for us. Just the moment I can think of, I can see in my mind of It's a Wonderful Life is when Jimmy Stewart is realizes he is no longer George Bailey. George Bailey realizes he's no longer George Bailey. There's a close-up shot, and he's like, he's actually maddened, right? He's mad in his eyes, and he's looking around, and it's just this feeling of just fear, the realization that a man is no longer who he is himself, and then put that together with the struggle of the guys in the best years of our lives. What is that telling us about? What do those two things tell us about America in 1946, 47?
One of the things, at least in terms of how the movie show these kind of things, is it shows a kind of crisis in masculinity in some ways, that men are different now. And we saw some of this in films from the Depression, where men are very much affected. Men in breadlines, men who had fought in World War I are now destitute. But after World War II, we might see a different kind of representation of men in Hollywood. And there are men who are scared, men who can't cope with the issues around them, men who get really angry, men who throw things, men who hit their kids, that kind of thing. So we might be seeing a kind of masculinity that we might associate with films from the 60s and after. The new heroes who come in, Robert De Niro, those kinds of guys. But we're actually seeing that in 1945, 1946, men who are both flawed and kind of ruined in some ways and have to figure out how to come to grips with what they've seen, what they've done. And so it's a different view of men. My students, when they see It's a Wonderful Life, are always knocked out by the scene where it's kind of like the scene that you talked about, but it's a scene where George is just fed up with what's going on in his house. The daughter is playing the piano, they're dressing the tree, and he just explodes at the banality of his life. And he breaks the staircase and throws and it's an incredible scene of a man just losing control. And we're not used to seeing that in Hollywood. And the same way, in the best years of our lives, we're not used to seeing men who are physically broken, the man who's lost both of his arms, but the men who are emotionally broken as well. So I think it might mark a new kind of representation of men.
And what's interesting to me about that is that it's not as played up in the final part, which I think most people know. But if you look at this guy's life, he's always doing the behind the scenes work that needs to be done, and frequently not taking credit for it. Or even in the case early on when he's a kid, he's working the pharmacy, like he basically saves somebody's life because the pharmacist is in massive despair because his son died, which it was 1919, and the Telegraph said he died from Spanish flu, which that's a throwback that nobody would have gotten 15 years later. But he saves the life of the child and saves the pharmacist's life, as he later realizes. But he can't say anything to anybody. He keeps it to himself. Yeah. And then he's constantly helping these people get these loans, and he doesn't brag about it, right? And when you go into World War II, there's an interesting thing that's kind of in there, but it's not teased out later on. They say he didn't go to war. He stayed here and did all the work that needed to be done to keep the war going. And he did all the thankless things, right? He gathered together the things for recycling. He made sure the town was safe, none of which get awards. And then afterwards, it's just constantly there. And that interesting placement in World War II of him doing these behind the scenes stuff that gets no credit, but has to happen. It fits within it. But I kind of felt like that hasn't been teased out enough in the way people talk about it, because that's essential. And there is a crisis of masculinity. Just a side note, psychology as a professional field comes into the public because of the testing they do on soldiers to see if they're fit for combat. And men get told they're not fit for combat, and it creates a crisis of masculinity for them. And so there is a lot of attention in kind of Reader's Digest and these other periodicals about making men feel okay about that. So that is kind of under the radar crisis, and it's right there in the movie. And the poor guy, he just keeps on going while his brother becomes a hero.
Yeah. It's a great film about people who only stand and wait and who do stuff in the background. And in fact, one of the most really stunning scenes in that film, in It's a Wonderful Life. You're talking about someone who does things just to help other people, and he saves, as you mentioned, the pharmacist's son dies of flu. It's a terrible, horrible moment that we're not used to seeing in films at that time. The 1919 flu is not talked about that much in films. And if you remember, young George saves another patient from taking poison because the pharmacist sends the wrong drug over.
Yeah.
And when the pharmacist finds out, he really savagely beats George up. It's one of the most shocking scenes in the film. He slaps him in the head a bunch of times, and then realizing what he's done, hugs him just passionately. And I think we're also not used to seeing in films at that time these scenes of incredible, like, physical, violent anger on the part of men, and also the possibility for this incredible physical closeness of men with boys, men with their kids, that kind of thing. So the intensity of all the masculine emotion is heightened here. And I think you're absolutely right too in saying that, most of the films in World War II celebrate the men who fight. We think of the John Wayne films, those kinds of movies that are all about the guys who take the island, the guys who kill 1 million Germans and Japanese, that kind of thing. We don't see that many films about men who can't fight. And so in that way too, It's a Wonderful Life is sort of an anti-World War II film, because it shows a man who cannot fight because of a physical disability. He's deaf in one ear. And so again, it's not the kind of a narrative we're used to, and not the kind of a man we're used to, because it's not John Wayne, it's not Robert Mitchum, it's not the hero who saves the day in World War II on the battlefield. It's much more kind of a throwback to the anti-World War I films of the 20s, early 1930s, when, of course, nobody thought World War I had been a good idea. Yeah. And we kind of lose that with the heroic films of World War II. So this too is why It's a Wonderful Life is just an odd film in some ways. And as you said too, Bob, the Best Years of Our Lives is an odd film because it questions what we did in World War II.
The hero of It's a Wonderful Life is arguably Mary.
Well,
awesome.
Donna Reed is so incredible. And
incredible. And let's talk about her for a minute, because this is this the accepted role of women? Like, just as George was doing all the work that had to be done all his life, he's the older son in the prodigal son story. That's who George is. He's the dutiful son who does the work, who makes the sacrifice for the father, for the family, because it's the right thing to do. He does it until he can't take it anymore. Right. Mary is the dutiful wife, loves him from the time they're little kids. They get married. One of the greatest scenes, I think, in the film that has such a contrast to it is after the scene when they're all swimming at the high school, when they fall into the pool, and then they're taking that walk, and she loses her clothes, and it's this like really romantic and whimsical romantic comedy, right? It could be who was that, Hepburn and Cary Grant, was that Hepburn and Tracy Hepburn, like a bringing up baby type of a thing. But then immediately the scene is broken by the brother and Uncle Billy coming to say that the father has had a stroke. And it goes from light, whimsical to darkness, like in a second. But Mary, when George is struggling and when he's missing, she's the one who goes around to the town and gets everybody. You got to help out George. He's helped you out. You got to help him out. And so she is ultimately the heroine of this film.
I think that's right. And, this isn't to make a case for a feminist Capra, but the women in his films are always really interesting. And if you see Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is about a senator who shouldn't be one, really, it's the secretary who works for him who is the power behind the senator. And of course, it's Jean Arthur, who's amazing. In Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, it's Jean Arthur again. The women in Capra's films are always incredible. Barbara Stanwyck made a bunch of films for him, and she's an amazing and powerful actress. Donna Reed, the Mary character in It's a Wonderful Life, is perhaps not quite like that. But Donna Reed herself is an amazing actress. And if you're like me, you grew up watching her on the Donna Reed show.
Yeah.
Where, you know, she vacuums in pearls and you know, that kind of thing. And she's the dutiful mother and wife. It's hard to think of her in the role she played during World War II in the early 1950s, where she's just incredible and her characters are very deep. And it's hard to know how much of that is the character as written and how much of that is her just being a really intense, powerful actress. If you see her in They Were Expendable, which is a John Ford 1946 World War II film that is, again, very skeptical about what the war was fought for. If you see her in From Here to Eternity in 1953, I think it is, where she plays the prostitute who falls in love with Montgomery Clift. And if you see her in It's a Wonderful Life, she's an unrecognizable actress compared to the woman in the television show of a few years later. So she herself brings incredible depth to the role of Mary. And I would agree with you, she's the one who saves the band. She's the one who saves George's life in so many ways. And she's the one who, you know, tells him when he's a kid, I love you and will for the rest of my life. She says that to him in his deaf ear so he can't hear. But, you know, she waits and she just loves him, but in ways that don't seem to us now as being so typical and sickly sweet that we might associate with films. Yeah. And she's a character in her own right, as is, I would say, the bad girl in the film, played by Gloria Graham, who is herself a really interesting, compelling character. So again, I don't want to say that Capra is a feminist.
No.
He's not. But the female characters in his films are very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I wanted to add here the whole time was, you know, when George disappears, it's like, what happens to everybody? You're like, well, his brother drowned because nobody was there to save him. Like all the people who own their own houses, they're like living in squalor and, you know, hovels, right? The uncle's killed himself. And the worst one, the real peak where you're like, and the worst outcome is, Mary is a old maid who's a librarian. She's unfulfilled because she's not married, which I think like downsides. While Mary is a dynamic character and I love her in that film, it does kind of be like, I don't think you're necessarily pushing for equality here.
Hey, Ben, how does Kelly being an archivist feel about that?
Well, fortunately, I was born, Bob, so she's not an old maid and done.
You saved her from that. You saved her from that.
You know, we can also say the other bad sign about Pottersville is that the bar is now a jazz club where Black men play jazz. You know, this place looks great. You know, let's hear the music. Yeah. Fantastic. So, you know, there are lots of ways we can critique this film and go, maybe, you know, we shouldn't just celebrate this film. And Pottersville does have some things going for it in some ways. So this isn't just to say that everything about the film is great and amazing, and you know, it's a complex, weird, strange film. But you're absolutely right that Marion becoming a librarian is sort of the worst possible fate that can be imagined. When you might go, that might not be the case.
In your book, Eric, you talk about this film being shown in San Quentin. Can you tell that story?
Well, I just thought this was so interesting. In writing the book, I did a lot of work at the Capra Archive, which is at Wesleyan, which is a terrific place to do research. And in looking at the file for It's a Wonderful Life, I found this cache of letters that inmates at San Quentin had written after a screening of the film there in 1947. And just to back up, you know, this is an era of kind of progressive prison systems. And the warden at San Quentin at the time thinks that guys should be able to experience arts and culture in prison. There's a San Quentin newspaper. There's a lot going on there that's really interesting. And so there are at least weekly film screenings there. And most of the films are the typical kind of Hollywood stuff, the musicals, the comedies, that kind of thing. But the warden does bring in a special screening. It's a big deal of It's a Wonderful Life. And then he asks the men after the screening to write down their thoughts about the film. And I'm not sure that he asked them to do that for any other film. He wanted them to, this was kind of a film education moment, and he wanted to see if they could somehow learn something about themselves through the film. And the men write these incredibly moving letters about the film that the warden then sends to Capra. And, you know, it's always possible that some of the men were writing these things to please the warden. They understood what the assignment was. They wanted to make it seem as if they had learned a valuable lesson from the film. But a lot of it also seems quite sincere. And they really connect to Uncle Billy's alcoholism in the film. They really connect to the way families are torn apart. They really connect to George trying to kill himself, which many of them had tried to do. And many of the letters are all about how they see themselves and various characters in the films, drinking too much, destroying your family in a number of ways, trying to kill yourself. And they pick up on things that maybe average viewers might not, especially the links they make to Uncle Billy, who is an important character in the film, but also a peripheral one, and really is someone who's challenged by a lot of stuff. And so the men's responses are just incredibly moving and are unlike other responses you tend to see to this film or other films. And it's a film that the inmates there really seem to connect to in powerful ways, and in ways that go beyond just trying to please the warden and make it seem as if they've learned something from this film. It really has an effect on them. And a lot of them talk about this film made them cry for the first time in years, because they saw themselves in the film. They saw what they had done to the people they loved in what goes on in this film. They saw the solutions that George takes, thinking of killing himself, as the solutions that they themselves thought of at some point. And so reading through these responses to the film was just an incredibly moving experience for me. And I have the feeling that if you were in San Quentin at the time, 1946, 1947, you had done some terrible stuff. You know, you weren't in there for petty crime. You were a serious criminal. And so it's really moving to see these men respond to a film about someone's life just going down the drain in so many ways, and about the solutions he tried that, you know, were not good ones, the way he almost destroys the family. It was really an incredible experience for me, 50 years after the men had written this stuff, to read what they thought about the film.
I want to make sure that we cover what I think is one of the most fascinating topics here, aside from the story, because there's the story of the film being made, there's the story of its reception at the time, and then there is this story of how every single one of us has at least believes we've seen it, even if we've only seen the last 30 minutes 100 times. And this goes back to a clerical error and law. Some of the, what you might say is some of the least soulful elements of American social life bring to us this dynamic film and make it into the holiday classic it is. And I don't want to give away too much. Eric, could you just tell the story of why it is that most of us know about this film today?
It's a weird story. And, you know, when I talk to my students about film, I sometimes tell them that you can understand a whole lot about film by understanding tax law and copyright law. They roll their eyes and they don't care. And I'm not qualified to talk about these kinds of things. But this is a case where copyright law seems to have made this film a classic. As I said, the film was produced by Capra's production company, Liberty Films. The company is founded in 1945 or so, right at the end of the war. And it goes out of business really in 1948 or 1949. They only make 2 films, both of them by Capra. And then they go out of business, and all the guys involved sign with other studios. And so over time, the 2 films that they made just kind of, no one owns them. And so they go out of copyright because no one had ever, once again, picked up the copyright to It's a Wonderful Life, to State of the Union, the other film that the company makes.
So just to, like, at the time, just to clarify, there's 28-year copyright.
Yes.
And after 28 years, and this stuff's been changing over time. They keep on seeming to nudge it towards the ownership of the copyright, but at this time, 28 years. And you could then refile for another 28-year period, but you had to do the paperwork. So in 1974, this comes up, and after multiple, acquisitions of things, they forget to file the paperwork, which means that it's now public domain.
Yes, and it's 1974, 75, it becomes a Christmas perennial. And it's because it's that 28-year mark, as you say, that, marks the film going out of copyright, nobody thinking to pick it up. And so it becomes a film that anyone can show at any time. And that's what takes place. So it goes on, at that time, there were films on the local channels late at night. There were film shows called The Fabulous 52, where once a week a local station would show a film. And so this becomes a really easy film to show because you don't have to pay anything to show it. You don't buy the film, you just show the film. And so somebody gets the idea, I guess, and I'm not sure which was the first local channel to do this, but somebody gets the idea, well, here's a free film. It's got Jimmy Stewart, let's show it on Christmas because it's a Christmas themed film. And I think within a couple of years, it just becomes a film that everyone shows at Christmas because it's free and people seem to like it. So because it's not part of any library, we always hear now about how Turner Classic Films has bought all the films from MGM or Paramount, bought an entire library of films. That wasn't the case with this film. It was a standalone free film that could be shown by anyone at any time. So in a lot of ways, it's an accident of copyright law that this film becomes a classic and that this film becomes a Christmas film.
Yeah, and it's genius because it's an over 2 hour long film. You can run it on repeat throughout the day. Your staff requirements are minimum. Your royalties to show the film are like zero. And so you just sit back, go home, and let everybody watch it. So if you cut on the TV, especially when there aren't that many channels, you're going to see it, and it just becomes a part of your nostalgia in the background. It's brilliant.
No, that's absolutely true. I think, yeah, please. Yeah. I think
finish your thought. Finish your thought.
I think I first saw the film in 1974 or 75 on a local channel in LA when it wasn't a big deal. I watched it with my parents and sister. And I think that's how a lot of people started to experience the film. You had limited viewing options back then. And so you watched the movie that some local channel might be screening, and starting in 1974 or 75, because of this accident of copyright law, this is the film that you watch.
Every year I watch this film and I have the same inner dialogue while I'm watching it. And the scene comes up, the scene when Mary and George are about to go on their honeymoon. They're about to travel the world together as a couple, which George has always wanted to do. Now, he and Mary, they got a fistful of dollars. They're about to do it, but then there's a run on the bank and the run on the savings and loan. And once again, Mary is the hero, right? George is trying to calm everybody down. The money's not here. It's in Ben's house and it's in Eric's house. And we are all a community. We are brothers and sisters, right? What's mine is yours. We're paying for each other's middle-class lifestyle. We are sharing. We are a community. They're like, no, we want our money. Yeah. Mary shows up with the money and says, we got money. And they start calling in. People are calling in their loans, and George is paying them back, paying them loans at least.
It's a great scene. And Mary, again, gives up her honeymoon to save the bank. George gives up his dreams of seeing the world, which is all he wants to do from when he's a young boy. He says when he's a kid, he's a member of the National Geographic Society, and all he wants to do is see the world. And he just can't. It's about being stuck. And, Capra made a film in 1932 called American Madness, which is a terrific film. And it's the blueprint for It's a Wonderful Life, because it's all about a bank run. And we should say that during the Depression, the banks closed when Roosevelt's elected, he closes all of the banks for a period of time. And so to stop people trying to withdraw all of their money from banks, because so many banks are failing during the Depression. And that film becomes the blueprint for It's a Wonderful Life. In American Madness in 1932, it's a young man who saves the bank, a young man played by Pat O'Brien who works at the bank and sees the man who owns the bank, the guy who's kind of like George, as sort of a father. In 1946, they changed that really to Mary, who saves the bank. And it's interesting that it's the woman who becomes the economic driver of the film and decides what to do with the money. But it's just a wonderful scene too, though, of thwarted masculine desire. George just can't leave that small town, and he never will. And it's so moving in the claustrophobia of that scene. George is stuck there.
Yeah, and I want to say this, because this is the dual sides to it, right? Because you're right, Bob. Like, she is the hero in many moments, unless you realize that, like, at almost every moment, she is actively working to undermine George's sense of dreams, right? Like, he wants to travel the world, and she picks up a rock, hits a third floor piece of glass, and wishes that he'll never get to fulfill his dreams. And then when they're about to leave town and he's like, we don't have any money, she's like, I've got the money we were going to spend getting you out of town once. Like, she's constantly there throwing down. And then she goes, don't worry, you'll be fine. We're going to move into that house that you said you wouldn't want to live there if you were a ghost. So you can see that.
And then he says to her, why do we have all these stupid kids?
Yeah, no. And then later on, he's like, he looks over the girl like, could you cut it out? What are you going on with your music for? Because you told me to, Daddy. Shut up. But it's like, but I wonder though, because like from the one hand, you can see this as like the heavy-handed woman trying to kill a man's dreams. But I honestly, like, when I think about it, I think there's something deeper there, because if you look at the setup, like, she really does seem to know him, right? And sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who can see the value that we have that we don't see. Yeah. And sometimes when you get frustrated with, I don't know, doing things like making a podcast that you do because you love it, but doesn't necessarily bring in any revenue for you or your family, sometimes you'll be like, what am I doing? And your wife will be like, this matters. And you're like, thank you. You know what I'm saying? Like, you need the people around you. But I just wonder, like, when you look at her, if she doesn't realize what a hero George is in this subtle way, and when she wishes for those things, it's not against him, but actually for him.
Well, that's interesting, and I think it does make her one of the most compelling characters in the film too. But you're absolutely right; she does thwart him herself in some ways, and she does wish upon that thrown rock that they never go any place and stay right there and never leave the small town. So she's a complicated character in a good way, and we can even probably, and I think this is a sign of the richness of her character too. We can imagine an entirely new film made from her point of view, where she's the main character. It's a Wonderful Life told through Mary's point of view as opposed to his.
Are we pitching?
Oh,
that's exactly a great idea. It's $1 million idea.
Let me get my pitching stance.
I think we just got rich, guys.
Exactly. Don't let anyone know. This is our.
That's right.
But and in some of the best films, you can imagine a whole other film told by another character's point of view, and often it's the woman who is kind of the secondary character in the film. But you can imagine a whole other film being from her. And now that you mention it, this could be.
Let's pitch. We'll set up some meetings.
Exactly.
We'll get them on the books for the first week of January.
We'll talk to your people. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, so let me ask you guys about this. Mr. Potter, he's the bad guy. He's the banker. Was there a backlash to It's a Wonderful Life? Like, this is to me, this is a very populist that time of period populace, not this time period populace. So what like that scene in when the savings and loan is when there's a run and they give their money and Mr. Potter's the bad guy, he's the banker. This seems to go against, a lot of present day sensibilities.
This is interesting. And, there are lots of films where the bad guy is the banker, lots of Depression films. So audiences were kind of used to that. And they're kind of used to that in Capra films, although usually in Capra films, the bad guy is redeemed in some way, but not in this film. In 1946, 1947 or so, no one really pays much attention to this. Or if they do, they point out the cliche of the banker being bad guy. In the 1950s, though, something interesting takes place. Of course, we all know about this. There's a House Un-American Activities Committee that is determined to ferret out leftists and communists, anybody who isn't towing a conservative party line, to get them out of university, entertainment, other kinds of media, that kind of thing.
Good thing we don't do that stuff anymore. Go ahead, go on.
Yeah, yes, of course. Thank God we don't do this kind of stuff now. There are ongoing discussions about the movies, because it's understood that the movies are controlled by communists, leftists, Jews, all the people that these guys want to get rid of. And so there's some discussion on the House Un-American Activities Committee about It's a Wonderful Life. They pull up a few films and they talk about It's a Wonderful Life. And we should point out that Capra is as conservative as it gets. He never votes for a Democrat in his life. He's a hardline Republican. He's very much a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of a guy. He is conservative. But It's a Wonderful Life comes up in the 1950s in HUAC hearings, because it's seen suddenly as an anti-capitalist film, because someone like Potter, who wants to build buildings and spread the city out and have big banks, because Potter is a bad guy. So in 1955 or so, there's a moment where some people in government, as crazy as this seems, see this as a film that is a sign of Hollywood's commitment to leftist politics, because the film is suddenly seen as an anti-capitalist one.
Even though the main character really actually just owns basically a smaller bank.
Of course. This shows, how crazy this period was. And of course, we're getting echoes of this now as we speak. But it shows how insane the period was when it came to talking about movies. Now, this doesn't go anywhere. There's not much ongoing discussion about this, but this film and some others come up as signs of Hollywood's leftist proclivities, because they're determined to make the capitalists the bad guys. But of course, as you say, Jimmy Stewart is as much a capitalist as anyone else.
He's helping people acquire private homes.
Yeah, and you can imagine him building developments in the years to come. So of course, yeah. But this is in fact, Capra himself, the FBI comes to him in 1950 or so, and they start to suspect him of leftist leanings. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth, because in 1943 or 1944, he had made a documentary for the Army called The Battle of Russia. And to do so, he had worked actively with the Russians. He got film from them, some of their experts to talk about the film. And they say to him, how could you possibly have worked with the Russians? And they were an ally of ours. What else could I possibly do? And the government is still not convinced. And he says, I have awards from Churchill. I have awards from de Gaulle. There's no way to possibly question what my motives might be. And they keep saying, you worked with the Russians. And so he just throws up his hands and goes, there's nothing else I can possibly say. Yes, I worked with the Russians. And his FBI file is in fact revealing and interesting, because we know well how the government went after people on the left. Here they're going after a guy who's so conservative that there's no questioning what his politics are, and they still suspect him because he worked with one of the US's allies during the war. So this again is a sign of the insanity of the 50s when it comes to this kind of political witch hunting.
It's so stupid. It's like I love the way they're like, all right, these guys over here, like they're it's Jewish run Hollywood, right? And they're like, yeah, so they made a movie against bankers, and they're like, wait a second, I thought our stereotype was also that Jewish people were bankers, and they're like, this doesn't make any sense. Anybody just want to rage for hate? And they're like, that's kind of what we do. It's just like
Yeah.
the stupidity of anti-Semitism. Good Lord.
So when we
Exactly it.
so when we started, Eric, you said that this was Frank Capra's last film. Explain.
It's his last great film. He makes a film 2 years later. Once again, this is only the second film. The next film that he makes is the second and last film made for Liberty Films, a production company he co-founds. That film was not so great. It's interesting. It's made for a much smaller budget than It's a Wonderful Life because they had to try to save money in some ways. It's based on a hit play. It's fine. It's a Hepburn Tracy film, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, so it's a big deal. It hasn't stood the test of time quite so well. It's not the Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn film we think of now. After that film comes out, Capra's production company folds. The other two guys, George Stevens and William Wyler, still cannot make films for their own production company because they're bound to other studios for a few more years. And Capra just seems to get really disillusioned and depressed. He signs on with Paramount Pictures as a studio director. Paramount at the time was the cheapest, worst studio going. And he just makes a couple films for them with Bing Crosby, Here Comes the Groom, Riding High. That just are terrible films. Riding High is a remake of a previous Capra film. Here Comes the Groom is kind of is not much now. Bing Crosby is a big star at the time. The film does not do well. And after those two films, which kind of sink, Capra just retires. He comes back to make a couple more films, A Hole in the Head and Pocketful of Miracles in 1963, which is another remake of a previous Capra film, Waiting for a Day. But after It's a Wonderful Life, he makes only 4 or 5 more films over the next 17 or 18 years. He makes a wonderful series of science films for AT&T that are designed for TV, which are great, and which we can still see now. Hemo Magnificent, The Cosmic Ray, and a few others. But his film career more or less ends with It's a Wonderful Life. He's 49. His contemporaries at the time, Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, William Wyler, Howard Hawks, all make really compelling films into their 70s. Capra is pretty much done before he's 50. And it's in part because his company folds and he doesn't quite know what to do with himself. It's in part because he makes a couple of bad decisions in terms of who he's going to make films with and what films he's going to make. And he just kind of recedes. And I think I began by talking about how when I saw my first Capra film in 1970 or 71 or so, it was the beginning of an attempt on Capra's part to reestablish his name by writing an autobiography, going on college tours, that kind of thing, lecture tours. But really, it's not until 1970 or so that he becomes a name once again. And then, as you mentioned, it's not until 1974 or 1975 when It's a Wonderful Life kind of explodes on the scene that he really regains any of the previous celebrity that he had. So It's a Wonderful Life, which now we see as this really astonishing, rich, dense film, is in some ways the last film before, just as I said, a precipitous decline. The only other decline like this that comes to mind is Preston Sturges, who started to make films a little bit after Capra did, and like George Stevens, is seen as a new, improved Capra in many ways, making kind of screwball film that Capra starts, but doing it even in some ways better and in a more modern way. Sturges too, after 1947 or 48, just falls off a cliff. And he and Capra are the two careers that are somewhat inexplicable. And Capra does go from being perhaps the most respected filmmaker in the country and one of the most in the world in 1939 or 1940 or so, to being forgotten by 1952 or 53.
So you wouldn't parallel that with Charlie Chaplin?
Well, Chaplin's career is different. Chaplin's career and his decline, if there is one, is both one of choice. He just doesn't want to make as many films, and also it's a political issue that's forced upon him. He is a victim of the Red Scare and kind of rises above that too in many ways. But Chaplin never stops being famous. People are always watching his films from the teens, the 20s, they're always watching Modern Times. He just stops making films or makes them very sporadically. Someone like Capra goes from being a household name to being forgotten. And so there are parallels there, but Chaplin is always one of the most famous people in the world for good reasons and bad. He just chooses, it seems, after the late 1940s or so, to make fewer films. And really, he had been slowing down since 1928 or 1929, where it would take him now years to make a single film. So his career arc is different.
Yeah, especially after they lock him out of the country when he leaves and
Well,
they just won't let him back in. That's just like, that's insane.
Chaplin never becomes a citizen of the US, which is fine. Yeah. He's always a citizen of the UK. And the State Department takes away his passport when he leaves the country, so he can't come back. So he's forced into exile. And so after 1940 or 1950 or so, he makes very few films. And in part, that's by choice too. He's getting older, he's rich, he has a bunch of kids. He has a nice life, I think, in Switzerland. But his career is really an interesting one. And in some ways parallels a career like Capra's, in some ways is vastly different from it.
Yeah, could I, before we go on, and we can wrap it up, Bob, sorry. But I just want to drop this in here for you guys, because I did to you guys what I did to myself. I was late one night reading and found out that in 1974, It's a Wonderful Life came into the public domain. And then I went to sleep thinking we could use all of the clips here in this podcast to illustrate. And woke up the next day, kept on reading, and found out that in 1993, they did reassert control over it through the soundtrack and through the original book. So unfortunately, guys, you can't just play it for free. So your dreams of a small media empire are over.
But
if you know that, it's possible that Ted Turner may have bought the film at some point too, because he colorized it. So there must have been some ownership change or something then too.
There was a Supreme Court case in 1990 that basically opened the way for them to come in and claim that they didn't own the film, but they had acquired the soundtrack and they owned the script option for the original novella that it was based off of. And so they use ownership of that to assert ownership over the script, and so now it's back to belonging to an individual corporation.
I'm glad to know that. Thank you. That's really interesting. And once again, it proves that the best way to study film at times is through the law.
And if you want to watch it, Thanksgiving Day, USA Network, which is owned by NBC Universal, plays it all day long, and then it'll be played on Christmas Eve on NBC, and then I think on Christmas Day all day long on one of those NBC networks, so maybe Bravo even. So enjoy It's a Wonderful Life. And Eric, we have enjoyed having you. You have made our lives more wonderful.
That's right.
as I do.
Yes. Own it.
It was
Don't
really
be George Bailey. Own it.
It was really fun. Thank you so much.
A true pleasure. Thank you so much, Eric Smoodin, Dr. Eric Smoodin from UC Davis. We are thankful to have had you on the show.
Thanks a lot. It's great.